Greetings and welcome to the course of U.S. history. That was creepy. Hello and welcome to the course of U.S. history. I'm your host, Mr. Samuelson. That was a lot better. Last time, in the course of U.S. history, we looked at culture in the southern colonies. Here we particularly focused on the southern farming systems and the system of slavery. Today, we're going to be talking about the foundations of what will become American democracy and those roots in England and how the colonists are going to react to those ideas. Now, let's take a look back at some of those founding ideas of American colonies. And that at first, England was very hands-off. They did not run the colonies. Most colonies were governed by proprietors, people like William Penn, who simply owned the colony and it was his personal property and he could do with it as he wished. Or they were governed by colonial legislatures, that is, they governed themselves. Now, after the English Civil War, King Charles II starts to realize that he needs to take a little bit greater control over his colonies, that he wants to have firmer control. So he starts to look at the idea of making these colonies all royal colonies, that is, all the property of the English king. He wants them to belong to him. Now, his brother, King James II, he is an autocrat. He loves to have absolute power, and he is going to be even more forceful about this. There's no doubt as to the fact that King James II wants to rule everything. He wants to be in charge. And the colonies don't like this very much. They start to really resent England during the reign of King James II. Now, it turns out the colonists are not alone in this. He wasn't liked in England either. And they eventually forced King James II out of power. Now, this is not too long after that English Civil War. Let's recall his brother, King Charles II, was the son of King Charles I, the guy who had his head cut off at the beginning of that Civil War. Charles II comes back, and then James inherits from him. So this is not all that far away from Parliament really having a lot more control. So they don't like this absolute rule, and they kick out James II. And he realizes he's really unpopular. He's going to lose if this comes down to a fight. So he is going to go. He leaves. But he's able to negotiate something for his daughter, Queen Mary. Queen Mary is going to successfully take control of the English monarchy. She just has to agree to two things. One of them is this gentleman right here by her side. That is William, who will become King William, who's a noble in the Netherlands. So they become William and Mary. So they will be co-monarchs and rule together. They also have to accept the English Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights is going to put severe limitations on their power. There will be no more absolute monarchies in England. The Bill of Rights puts a stop to that. Now, what does it do? Well, it guarantees rights, basic rights, to all English citizens. So there are rights such as representation in Parliament, a Parliament that is not going to be disbanded by the king. It's going to be this permanent body. Guarantees rights to all citizens to representation in Parliament. So you get to vote for the people who go to Parliament and make the laws. Now, colonial legislatures are also allowed to return under William and Mary. But the royal governors aren't going anywhere. The governors had been put in place by Charles and James, and they had a sort of version of absolute power while Charles and James were in charge. Now they're going to be in charge of enforcing laws and enforcing the will of the English Parliament. And the colonial legislatures will exist to advise them as to the wishes of the colonists. So we have this power-sharing arrangement. The colonies are not being left alone like they were in the past. They've just gotten a little bit of their voice back. Now, English citizens back in England were guaranteed that representation in the English Parliament, but this is not going to be the case in the colonies, because that English Parliament is going to be very unsure over who they really count as an English citizen within this English Parliament. Who are those full English citizens? Who are those full Englishmen? Who really gets representation in Parliament? Well, it's not going to be the colonists. Colonists had hoped that this English Revolution, this English Bill of Rights, would lead to more colonial influence in Parliament, but they're going to be upset by that. Not too upset first. This is where the idea of no taxation without representation starts getting thrown about. And back in England, there's a lot of taxation, but they also have representation. They balance this out, and they argue that the colonists don't need this representation because the colonists aren't being taxed. They're at least not being taxed by England, and therefore they are not going to get that representation. Just because they're not getting taxed, though, doesn't mean that they don't have ways where England is making money off the colonists. See, to England, the colonies existed to earn profits for England. That's why you have colonies. So English merchants would buy and sell goods in the colonists, go back to England and pay taxes on those goods. So England's making money off of the merchants if they're not making it directly off the colonists. But in this way, the colonies are servicing England. The colonists do have to pay more for their goods that they have to buy from England because those merchants are being taxed, but they're not being taxed directly. That's the argument at the time. Now, the Navigation Acts make sure that this stays in place. There are a bunch of trade policies which were designed to help England and hurt the colonies, such as the idea that the colonists can only sell to English merchants and can only buy from English merchants. The colonists cannot sell to just anybody who shows up in their ports. They have to sell to England, they have to buy from England, and so England can set those prices. And in that way, really extract a lot of wealth from their colonies. That's the idea of the Navigation Acts. The colonists themselves are not crazy about this. They start to grow angry when they see these signs that they view as misrule. The idea that they're paying so much for these goods, that they're not getting paid much for what they're selling in England. Their tolerance for other forms of misrule is very thin. So we see a couple of instances. One noticeable one was Bacon's Rebellion. In 1676, Bacon rises in... oh, wait, no, that's not pork. That would be a different... Okay, there we go. Bacon's Rebellion. A man by the name of Bacon rose up in revolt against a governor. This was because the governor was being a little bit too friendly to Native Americans in the eyes of Bacon. The governor wanted to make sure that the Native Americans could maintain control of their land so that they could trade furs to the English. The English in Virginia, though, were getting a little bit overpopulated in some areas. They wanted to spread out west. They weren't supposed to. They did it anyway. Native Americans attacked them for doing it. The governor never stepped in to help those settlers defend themselves. And so the settlers turned on him and they attacked the governor. That rebellion was put down, but it was kind of putting the English government on notice that they had to look out for the interests of their settlers. Another interesting one was in 1733, a man by the name of Peter Zenger, who owned a printing press and ran a newspaper, was criticized and imprisoned by the governor of New York because he had been very critical of this governor, had accused that governor of corruption, and the governor of New York didn't like that very much. How dare you speak out against me? Threw him in jail. Well, it turns out that the governor of New York was corrupt. He was doing things that he shouldn't have been doing, and Zenger was simply telling the truth. And here we start to get the ideas of freedom of the press. That so long as Zenger is telling the truth when he prints these things, he's allowed to print it. And freedom of the press will grow out of this case. So this is kind of the foundations of American democracy. We've got a lot more to discuss on this, but I kind of want to discuss those roots within English society first. We'll get much more into American democracy when we look at the Declaration of Independence and the years that follow. Next time, however, we're going to be looking at an American way of life that starts to develop that is different from England, and how the colonists will eventually start to see themselves as Americans rather than Englishmen. Thank you for joining me today for the course of U.S. history, and farewell.